For 60 years they'd shared the same bed, the same coffee pot, the same quiet rhythm of life that most people only dream about. Their house sat on a tree-lined street in a small town where everyone knew each other's names, where kids still rode bikes without helmets and neighbors waved from their porches. It wasn't fancy, peeling paint on the shutters, a front step that creaked when you stepped on the third board, a garden that bloomed haphazardly every summer, but it was theirs. Every brick, every worn rug, every framed photo on the wall told a story only they fully understood. He woke before sunrise like he always had. Not because he couldn't sleep, but because he liked the stillness of early morning, the way the world held its breath before the day began. He'd shuffle to the kitchen in his slippers, fill the old percolator with water and grounds, and wait for that familiar gurgle that meant coffee was coming. She'd join him a few minutes later, wrapped in the same faded blue robe she'd worn for 20 years, her hair still messy from sleep. They never needed many words then. Just the clink of mugs, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional sigh as they settled into their chairs at the small kitchen table. They'd talk about small things, the weather, the neighbor's new dog, whether the tomatoes in the garden were ripening too fast. Sometimes they'd read the paper together, him with the news section, her with the crossword. She always finished it before he finished his second cup. 7 letters, a sudden burst of inspiration, she'd say, pencil hovering. He'd pretend to think hard, even though he knew she already had the answer. It was part of their dance, little rituals that had become as natural as breathing. They'd met in 1962 at a church picnic. He was home from college for the summer, tall and a little awkward, trying to impress his uncle by grilling burgers without burning them. She was volunteering at the lemonade stand, laughing at something her friend said, her eyes bright under the summer sun. He spilled ketchup on his shirt, trying to get her attention. She laughed again, not at him but with him, and that was it. They wrote letters all through his final year of school. Got married the next spring in a simple ceremony with daisies in her hair, and his brother as best man. No grand plans, no big speeches, just 2 young people promising to figure life out together. And they did. They bought the house with a loan so small it seemed impossible now. He taught history at the local high school. She worked nights at the county hospital as a nurse. Money was tight, but they made it work. They patched holes in the roof themselves, canned vegetables from the garden, and celebrated birthdays with homemade cake. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, each one arriving like a miracle they never took for granted. They stayed up through fevers, drove to endless soccer games, helped with homework at the kitchen table, long after their own eyes were heavy. There were hard times, of course. Once he lost his job when the school district cut budgets. For 6 months he took odd jobs, fixing fences, painting houses, while she picked up extra shifts. They ate a lot of beans and rice, but they never let the kids feel the strain. Another time, she fell down the basement stairs and broke her wrist. He took care of her like she'd always taken care of others, making meals, helping her dress, reading to her at night. They never kept score, never said, "You owe me." They just showed up. As the years passed, the children grew, moved away, got married, had kids of their own. The house got quieter, but not lonely. They filled the silence with walks around the block, trips to the library, Sunday drives with no destination. They watched their grandchildren grow from toddlers to teenagers, always saving cookies in the pantry just for them. Holidays were loud and chaotic, full of mismatched dishes and too many pies, and they loved every minute. Now in their late 80s, their bodies moved slower. His knees ached in the cold. Her hands trembled slightly when she poured tea. But their routine stayed the same. Every morning, coffee. Every evening, a walk if the weather allowed. Every night, a chapter from whatever book they were reading aloud. Sometimes history, sometimes fiction. Always something that made them pause and say, "Remember when?" People in town often said, "They're the couple everyone wants to be." Not because they were perfect, they argued sometimes, forgot birthdays, left dishes in the sink, but because they chose each other, day after day, without fanfare. There was no grand romance in their story, no dramatic rescues or sweeping declarations, just loyalty, just showing up, just love that lived in the small things, holding the door, remembering how the other liked their eggs, sitting together in comfortable silence. Their children called often. The oldest, now a grandfather himself, still asked his father for advice about fixing his truck. The youngest daughter sent photos of her garden, knowing her mother would smile at the zucchini vines taking over the yard. They visited when they could, filling the house with noise and laughter. And when they left, the quiet felt different. Not empty, just waiting. He never thought much about how long they'd been together. 60 years wasn't a number he carried around. It was just life. Like the oak tree in the backyard that had grown from a sapling to a giant with branches that shaded the whole yard. It happened slowly, steadily, without anyone noticing until one day you looked up and saw how far it had come. She'd started feeling tired more often lately. Not the usual I stayed up too late tired, but a deep weariness that sleep didn't fix. She brushed it off. Getting old, she'd say with a shrug, but he noticed. Noticed how she leaned on the counter a little longer after standing up. How she sometimes paused mid-sentence, catching her breath. He didn't say anything. Didn't want to worry her, but he started making her favorite soup more often. Made sure the path to the bathroom was clear. Sat closer on the couch just in case. One morning, as they sat with their coffee, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was thin, almost translucent, but her grip was still strong. "You've been a good man," she said softly. He looked up surprised. "What's that for?" She just smiled. Just felt like saying it. He squeezed her hand back. "You've been my best friend," he replied. And that was enough. They didn't talk about death. Not really. They'd buried parents, siblings, friends. They knew it was coming for them too someday, but they didn't dwell on it. They were too busy living. There was still laundry to fold, a birdhouse to fix, a batch of cookies to bake for the new neighbors. Life wasn't about the big moments, it was about showing up for the small ones over and over, until you'd built something that lasted. Neighbors would see them on their porch in the evenings, two figures in rocking chairs, silhouetted against the setting sun. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just watched the fireflies blink on in the yard. No one ever heard them raise their voices. No one ever saw them walk past each other without a word. They were just there together, like two trees that had grown so close their roots were tangled beneath the soil. Their love wasn't flashy. It didn't need Instagram posts or anniversary trips to Paris. It lived in the way he always saved the last piece of pie for her, in the way she still folded his socks the way he liked them, pairs matched, toes aligned, in the way they remembered each other's stories and told them back when the other forgot a detail. It was in the quiet understanding that after all this time, they were each other's home. And so, on an ordinary Tuesday in early spring, with birds singing outside and the smell of coffee in the air, they sat at their kitchen table like they had thousands of mornings before. The world outside kept spinning. Cars passed, kids laughed down the street, a dog barked, but inside time felt soft, gentle, like a well-worn blanket. They didn't know what was coming. Didn't know that soon. Everything they thought they knew about their life together would shift. But for now, in this moment, they were exactly where they belonged, side by side, sharing silence, sharing coffee, sharing a life built one ordinary day at a time. He got up to refill her cup. She smiled as he poured, her eyes crinkling at the corners. The same smile that had caught his attention all those years ago at a church picnic. He didn't know it yet, but this quiet morning would be one of the last like it. One of the last before the ground beneath them cracked open and revealed a truth buried for decades. But today there was only this. The warmth of the mug in her hands, the sound of his footsteps on the linoleum, and the deep, unspoken certainty that they were in this together just like always. They'd faced storms before. Lost jobs, sick children, broken bones, grief that felt endless. But they'd always come out the other side hand in hand. That was their story. That was who they were. And even now, as the first shadows of something unknown began to gather at the edges of their peaceful life, neither of them could imagine a future where they weren't walking through it together. She stirred sugar into her coffee, 2 spoons, just like always, and looked out the window at the cherry tree starting to bud. "Spring's coming," she said. He nodded, sitting back down. "Yeah," he said. "It always does." And for a little while longer, that was enough. The first real sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. She'd been planting tulip bulbs in the backyard, their ritual every spring, even though she joked that at her age she might not be around to see them bloom. He was raking leaves nearby, keeping an eye on her without making it obvious. She stood up too fast, wobbled, and then just sat down hard on the damp grass. Not a fall exactly, more like her legs gave out. He was at her side in seconds, heart hammering, but she waved him off with a weak smile. "Just dizzy," she said. "Too much sun." But it wasn't the sun. 2 days later, after a trip to the doctor that turned into a rushed visit to the hospital, they got the news. Her heart was failing. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, quietly, like a clock winding down. The doctor used words like advanced, progressive, and weeks, maybe a couple of months. He spoke gently, but the words landed like stones. She listened calmly, nodding as if she'd been expecting this all along. Maybe she had. Maybe that's why she'd been so tired, why she'd started napping in the afternoons, why she'd stopped arguing when he insisted on carrying the groceries. They came home that evening in silence. The house felt different, smaller somehow, or maybe just heavier. He made soup, the kind she liked with carrots and barley, but neither of them ate much. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where they'd shared 60 years of meals, and stared at their bowls like they might find answers in the steam. That night, he lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, listened to her soft breathing, and tried to imagine a morning without her voice asking how he slept. The thought was so foreign, so wrong, that it made his chest ache. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder, just to feel her there, real and warm beside him. The next few days passed in a blur of doctor appointments, phone calls to the kids, and rearranging the house so she wouldn't have to climb the stairs. They moved their bedroom to the den, a room they'd used for storage and holiday wrapping, and set up a proper bed with fresh sheets and extra pillows. She protested at first, saying she wasn't an invalid, but he just smiled and said, "Humor me." Truth was, he needed to keep her close, where he could hear her if she called. She grew weaker faster than either of them expected. Some mornings she couldn't get out of bed without help. She stopped going to the garden, stopped reading the paper, but her mind stayed sharp, and her eyes, those same eyes that had looked at him with laughter, worry, pride, and love for 6 decades, still held that quiet strength he'd always admired. Then came the rain. A steady gray downpour that lasted 3 days straight, the kind of rain that makes the world feel hushed like it's holding its breath. On the 3rd afternoon, she asked him to sit with her. Not on the couch, not at the table, but on the edge of the bed where she could see his face clearly. He pulled a chair close, took her hand, and waited. She looked at him for a long time, her fingers tightening around his. Rain tapped against the window like a soft reminder that time was passing. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally, her voice low but steady. He nodded, bracing himself. He thought maybe it was about pain or fear, or something she wanted done after she was gone. He was ready to hear it, ready to promise anything, but what she said next stopped his breath in his throat. "It's about our oldest," she began, then paused, swallowing hard. He's not your son." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick, impossible to ignore. For a moment he thought he'd misheard. Maybe the rain was playing tricks. Maybe his ears were failing. But her eyes told him it was real. She was crying now, silent tears sliding down her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I was young," she whispered. "We'd had that fight, the big one, remember? When you went to stay with your brother for a few weeks?" He remembered. It had been early in their marriage, maybe their 2nd year. They'd argued about money, about expectations, about whether they were ready for children. He'd left in anger, convinced she didn't understand him. He'd come back a week later, ashamed and missing her so much it hurt. They never spoke of it again, buried it like a bad dream. "I was lonely," she went on, her voice breaking, "and there was someone from the hospital. It only happened once, just once, and then I found out I was pregnant." She looked down at their joined hands. "I panicked. I didn't know what to do, but when you came back, you held me like nothing had changed. You forgave me before I even asked, and I couldn't tell you. I thought it would destroy us." He sat frozen, his mind racing. Memories flooded in, his son's birth, the way he'd cried holding that tiny bundle, the pride he'd felt watching him take his first steps, graduate, get married. All of it, real, deep, true, but now shadowed by a single sentence, "You never told me," he said, his voice rough. "I wanted to," she said quickly, "so many times, but every year that passed it got harder. And then, he was yours, in every way that mattered. You changed his diapers, taught him to ride a bike, stayed up with him when he was sick. You loved him like your own, because you were his own. He stood up then, needing space, needing air. He walked to the window and stared out at the rain-soaked yard. The tulip bulbs they'd planted were probably drowning. He thought of his son, now a man with gray in his hair, a father himself, laughing at the dinner table, calling him Dad, without hesitation.
Had he ever suspected?
Did he look in the mirror and wonder why his eyes were a different shade? He turned back to her. She looked small in the bed, fragile, but her gaze was steady, full of regret, yes, but also something else. Something like hope. Why now? He asked. Why tell me now? Because I can't leave this world carrying that lie, she said softly. Not from you. Not after everything we've shared. I needed you to know the truth. But I also needed you to know that choosing you, every single day after that mistake, was the best thing I ever did. He didn't speak for a long time. The rain kept falling. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Outside, a bird called, confused by the gloom. He thought about walking out. Not far, just to the porch to breathe. But he didn't. Instead, he sat back down, took her hand again. You think I loved him less because of this? He asked, his voice quieter now. No, she whispered. I think you loved him more. And maybe that was true. Because love wasn't just blood. It was showing up. It was staying. It was changing diapers at 3 a.m., driving to baseball practice in the snow, sitting in hospital rooms during fevers. It was all the things he'd done, not because of biology, but because he'd chosen to. But still, the betrayal stung, not because of the affair. That was a lifetime ago, a moment of weakness in a young woman who felt abandoned. No, the sting came from the silence, 60 years of silence, 60 years of him believing one thing while she carried another. He looked at her, really looked. Saw the lines around her eyes, the silver in her hair, the hands that had held him through grief and joy. This woman had been his anchor, his home, and now at the end she was handing him a truth that could have shattered them decades ago. Did you ever regret it? He asked. Not telling me? Every day, she said without hesitation. But I also believed, deep down, that if I loved you enough, if I built a life with you that was honest in every other way, maybe it wouldn't matter. Maybe love could be bigger than one mistake. He sighed, long and slow. The anger was there, yes, but beneath it was something softer. Sadness, confusion, and, surprisingly, a strange kind of relief. Because now he understood little things he'd never questioned. Why their son had his mother's nose but none of his own family's features. Why she'd sometimes get quiet when old photos came out. It all made sense now, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek. You should have told me, he said, but I understand why you didn't. She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she might sleep. But then she opened them again, searching his face. Do you hate me? He shook his head. No, I could never hate you, and it was true. How could he? This woman had shared his life, his bed, his dreams. She'd stood by him when his father died, when he lost his job, when he doubted himself. She'd been his partner in every sense of the word. One secret, however painful, didn't erase 60 years of love, but it changed things. It had to. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he'd need time to sort through it. To talk to his son, maybe. To decide what this meant for the family they'd built. For now, though, she needed him. And he was still her husband. Still the man who'd promised to stay. He stood and went to the kitchen, made a fresh pot of tea, her favorite, with honey and lemon, and brought it back. She smiled weakly as he helped her sit up and handed her the mug. Thank you, she said. For what? He asked. For listening, she said. For not walking away. He sat beside her again, not speaking, just being there. The rain slowed to a drizzle. Sunlight broke through the clouds in thin golden streaks, lighting up the wet leaves outside. They sat like that for a long time, two old people in a quiet room, holding on to each other as the world shifted around them. The secret hung between them, heavy but no longer hidden, and in that moment something new began. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first fragile step toward it. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Didn't know if he'd wake up angry or sad or numb. But right now, in this room with the smell of tea and rain in the air, all he knew was that she was still here. And as long as she was, he'd be here too. Because that's what they'd always done. Stayed. Together. The days after the confession moved like thick fog, slow, heavy, and hard to see through. He went through the motions, made breakfast, checked her medicine, folded laundry, watered the plants that were starting to droop from too much rain and not enough sun. But inside, everything felt off balance, like a picture hanging crooked on the wall that no one else noticed but him. He still held her hand, still kissed her forehead before bed, still called her honey when he brought her tea. But something had changed, not in her, but in him. A quiet distance had settled between them, not of anger exactly, but of confusion. He didn't know how to look at her the same way. Every smile, every touch, every shared memory now carried a shadow he couldn't ignore. Their oldest son called that evening. He lived 2 towns over and usually visited every Sunday, but this week he'd been busy with his grandkids' school play. "How's Mom doing?" he asked, voice warm with concern. "She's resting," he replied, careful to keep his tone steady. "Tired, but okay." There was a pause. "You sound off, Dad. Everything all right?" "Just a long day," he said, forcing a lightness he didn't feel. "We'll see you Sunday, right?" "Wouldn't miss it," his son said and hung up. He stood in the kitchen holding the phone long after the call ended. That voice, so familiar, so full of trust, now echoed in his mind with a new question. "Whose son are you really?" He shook his head hard as if to clear it. That wasn't fair. The boy, no, the man had done nothing wrong. He'd lived his whole life believing what everyone else believed. He was innocent in all of this. But that didn't stop the ache. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, he went to the attic. It was a place they rarely visited now. Dusty, cramped, filled with boxes labeled in her neat handwriting. Christmas decorations, baby clothes, school papers. He found the one marked photos early years and carried it downstairs. He sat at the kitchen table under the soft glow of a single lamp and opened it. There they were, young, hopeful, standing in front of their first apartment, arms around each other, grinning like the future was guaranteed. Then came the baby pictures, first bath, first Christmas, first steps. He remembered everyone. The way his son had gripped his finger with tiny hands. The way he'd laughed when tickled. The way he'd run to him after falling off his bike, tears streaming, trusting that Dad would make it better. He flipped through the pages slowly, searching for something. What? He wasn't sure. A clue? A sign? But all he saw was love. Real messy, everyday love. The kind that shows up in scraped knees and bedtime stories and packed lunches. He stopped at a photo from his son's 5th birthday. Cake smeared on his cheeks, eyes bright with joy, sitting between them on the couch. He looked so much like her. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his smile. But he'd always thought that was just how kids were. Some took after Mom, some after Dad. He'd never questioned it. Now he saw it differently. He closed the album and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the house settle around him. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street. Somewhere upstairs, she coughed softly in her sleep. He thought about confronting her again, asking for details, when, where, who, but he didn't want to know. The truth was already heavy enough without names and dates attached. What mattered wasn't the moment it happened. It was the 60 years of silence that followed. The next morning, she was weaker. She struggled to sit up, her breath coming in short gasps. He helped her, moving gently, but his hands felt stiff, like he was handling something fragile that might break. She noticed. Of course she did. "You're angry," she said quietly. Once she was propped up with pillows. "I'm not angry," he said. But his voice betrayed him. It was flat, distant. "You don't have to pretend," she whispered. "I deserve your anger." He looked at her then, really looked. Her skin was pale, her lips dry. The woman who had once carried him through his darkest days now needed him to carry her. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to offer the comfort she was used to. "I don't know what I am," he admitted. "Hurt maybe, confused, betrayed, but mostly sad. Sad that you didn't trust me enough to tell me." She closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her temple into her hair. "I was scared," she said. "Scared you'd leave. Scared our family would fall apart. I thought if I just loved you enough, it would make up for it." "Love isn't a trade," he said gently. "You don't earn forgiveness by being good for 60 years. You earn trust by being honest." She nodded, not arguing, just accepting. Their daughter came by that afternoon with soup and fresh bread. She chatted brightly about her garden, her new puppy, her neighbor's cat that kept stealing her shoes. He smiled and nodded, played his part. But inside he was counting the hours until she left so he could be alone with his thoughts again. When she hugged him goodbye, she paused. "You okay, Dad? You seem..." Far away. I'm fine, he said, patting her back. Just tired. She studied him for a moment, then squeezed his arm. Call me if you need anything. Day or night. He watched her car pull away, feeling guilty for pushing her away with silence. But how could he explain? How could he say, your brother might not be your brother, without shattering everything? That evening, their youngest son called from across the country. He worked in software and rarely came home, but he called every week without fail. They talked about the weather, his job, his plans to visit in the fall. Normal things. Safe things. But halfway through the call, his son said, Hey, is Mom doing better? You sound heavier. He almost laughed. Heavier. Yes, that was exactly it. Like his chest was filled with wet sand. She's hanging in there, he said, just taking it day by day. I wish I could be there, his son said softly. You're doing enough, he replied, and meant it. Because love wasn't just presence, it was showing up in the ways you could. After the call, he sat on the back porch watching fireflies blink on in the gathering dusk. The garden was a mess, unweeded, overgrown, but he didn't have the energy to fix it. Nothing felt worth fixing right now. He thought about his son, the oldest. Remembered teaching him to fish at the lake when he was 8. The boy had been so proud when he caught his first sunfish, holding it up like a trophy. Look, Dad, I did it. And he'd ruffled his hair and said, You sure did, champ. Had that moment been less real because of a secret buried in the past? No. It had been real then, and it was still real now. The love hadn't been a lie. Only the origin story had been, but knowing that didn't make the hurt go away. The next few days blurred together. She slept more, ate less. The doctor came by, checked her vitals, spoke in hushed tones about comfort care. He nodded, asked questions, made notes, but his mind kept drifting back to that one sentence. He's not your son. He started avoiding the living room, where family photos covered the walls. He couldn't look at his son's graduation picture without wondering. Couldn't watch old home videos without hearing the echo of her silence. One afternoon, while she napped, he drove to the cemetery on the edge of town. Not because he planned to, he just found himself turning onto the road without thinking. He walked to the plot they'd bought years ago, side by side, under a maple tree. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where her name would soon be carved. What do I do now? He whispered to the wind. There was no answer, of course. Just the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. He thought about telling his son. Just calling him up and saying, There's something you should know. But what good would it do? The man was nearly 60. He had his own life, his own children. Did he need this truth now, when it would only bring pain and questions with no answers? And what about the rest of the family? Would they look at her differently? Would they blame her? Would they blame him for not knowing? He sat on a bench near the entrance, watching an old couple walk hand in hand down the path. They moved slowly, leaning on each other, but they were smiling. He wondered if they had secrets too. If every long marriage carried hidden rooms no one else could see. When he got home, she was awake, sitting up in bed with a book in her lap, though he doubted she'd read a word. She looked at him, her eyes full of apology. You went to the cemetery, she said. It wasn't a question, he nodded. Needed air, she reached for his hand. This time he let her take it. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. For all of it. He didn't say it's okay. Because it wasn't, not yet. But he didn't pull away either. That night he dreamed of their wedding day. The sun on her face, the way she'd squeezed his hand during the vows like she was holding on for dear life. In the dream, he asked her, Did you mean it? And she said, every word. He woke with tears on his cheeks. The next morning, their oldest son showed up unannounced. Had a free afternoon, he said, carrying a bag of groceries. Thought I'd check in. He helped his father put things away, then sat at the kitchen table while his father made coffee. They talked about nothing important. The leaky faucet, the neighbor's new truck, the price of gas. Normal father-son stuff. But as he watched his son stir sugar into his coffee, 2 spoons, just like his mother, something shifted inside him. This man had called him Dad his whole life, had come to him for advice, for comfort, for approval, had stood beside him at his mother's funeral, at his sister's wedding, at his own children's baptisms. None of that changed because of a secret from before he was born. The love was still real. The relationship was still real. Maybe that's what mattered. He looked at his son, really looked, and saw not a stranger, but the boy he'd raised, the man he was proud of. Blood or not, this was his son. Had always been. "You're a good man," he said suddenly. His son looked up, surprised. "What brought that on?" He shrugged, smiling faintly. "Just felt like saying it." His son grinned. "You've been a good dad. Best I could have asked for." And in that moment, the weight in his chest eased just a little. Later, after his son left, he went to her bedside. She was awake, watching the birds at the feeder outside the window. "I saw him today," he said softly. She turned to him, eyes wide with fear. "Did you?" "No," he said quickly. "I didn't tell him. I don't think I will." She let out a breath she'd been holding. "Thank you." "But I looked at him," he went on, "and I realized something. He's my son, not because of how he was made, but because of how I loved him. And that doesn't change." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief. He sat beside her, taking her hand. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things unsaid, yes, but also of understanding. He didn't forgive her yet. Not completely, but he was starting to see that love wasn't perfect. It was messy. It was human. And sometimes it carried secrets, but that didn't mean it wasn't real. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting golden light across the floor. And for the first time since she'd told him the truth, he felt like he could breathe again. The days grew shorter, and so did her breath. She slept more than she was awake now, and when she opened her eyes, they held a quiet kind of tiredness that went deeper than bone. He noticed how her hands trembled even when resting, how her voice had thinned to a whisper, how she sometimes forgot the names of the grandkids, though she'd always remember their faces, their laughter, the way they hugged her. He'd stopped fighting the silence between them. It wasn't the cold, heavy quiet from before, the kind that came from hurt and secrets. This silence was softer, like worn cotton. It held space for everything they couldn't say. The regret, the love, the years lost to a truth too big to carry alone. He sat with her more now, not just out of duty, but because he wanted to. Because every hour felt borrowed, and he didn't want to waste a single one. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the window again, she reached for his hand while he read aloud from a book of old poems, something they'd started years ago and never finished. Her fingers were cool, but her grip was firm, like she was anchoring herself to him. "Stay with me a minute," she said, her voice barely above a breath. He set the book down and turned to face her. "I'm not going anywhere." She smiled faintly, then closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, there was something new in them. Resolve, maybe, or peace. "I know you've been thinking," she said. "About what I told you. About him." He nodded slowly. He hadn't brought it up again, but it was always there, like a stone in his pocket. Present, but not always pressing. "I need you to know why I waited," she went on. "It wasn't just fear. It was love, strange as that sounds." He waited, listening. "When I found out I was pregnant," she continued, "I was terrified. Not just of you leaving, but of losing us. We were so young, so fragile, and I knew deep down that if I told you, it might break something we couldn't fix. So I made a choice. I chose to protect what we had. Even if it meant carrying a lie." He swallowed hard. "But you carried it alone." "Yes," she whispered. "And it got heavier every year. But every time I saw you with him, teaching him to throw a ball, helping him with homework, holding him when he cried, I knew I'd made the right choice. Because you loved him like your own. You were his father, not by blood but by heart." He looked down at their joined hands. His knuckles were swollen with age, hers pale and veined. 60 years of shared meals, shared worries, shared dreams, all built on a foundation that now felt cracked, but not broken. "I used to wonder," he said quietly, "if you ever looked at him and saw someone else." She shook her head slowly. "Never. From the moment he was born, he was ours. Yours and mine. The man who was part of that moment, he meant nothing after that. He was just a shadow. You were the light." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. "I should have told you sooner. I know that now. But back then, I thought I was saving us. And maybe I was." He thought about that. Maybe she was right. Maybe if she'd told him in those early years, raw and scared and unsure of himself, he wouldn't have handled it the way he did now. Maybe he would have walked away. Maybe their family would have unraveled before it even had a chance to grow. But that wasn't the life they'd lived. They'd lived this one, messy, imperfect, but full of real love. I don't know if I can forgive you all at once, he admitted. But I'm trying. That's enough, she said softly. More than enough. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain. Outside, a robin hopped across the wet grass, shaking water from its wings. Do you remember our first house? She asked suddenly, her eyes distant. He smiled. The one with the leaky roof and the kitchen that smelled like onions no matter how much you cleaned? She laughed, a soft, breathy sound. We patched that roof with tar and prayers. And you built that little shelf above the sink so I could keep my spices. I remember you burned dinner that night, he said. Tried to make pot roast and set off the smoke alarm. And you didn't complain, she said, looking at him. You just opened the windows and said, smells like home. He squeezed her hand. It did. They talked like that for hours about the little things no one else would remember. The time they got lost on a road trip and ended up at a diner with the best pie they'd ever tasted. The summer their dog ran away and the whole neighborhood helped look for him. The Christmas their youngest came down with the flu, and they spent the whole day making ginger tea and watching old movies. These weren't grand stories. No heroes, no drama, just two people building a life one ordinary day at a time. And in those memories, the secret didn't matter. It was just a single thread in a tapestry woven with thousands of others, most of them bright, strong, full of love. Later that evening, as the sky turned pink with sunset, she grew restless. She asked him to help her sit up, then to open the window just a crack. I want to smell the rain, she said. He did as she asked, then sat beside her, holding her hand as cool air drifted into the room, carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming lilacs. You've been my home, she said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been in days. He looked at her, surprised. I was just thinking the same thing about you. She turned her head toward him, her eyes clear and steady. All those years, I never stopped choosing you, even when I was scared, even when I messed up. You were always my person. He felt his throat tighten. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded, blinking back tears. I know I hurt you, she went on, and I'll carry that regret with me. But I hope you can remember the love more than the lie. I already am, he said. And it was true. The anger had faded. Not because he'd decided to let it go, but because it had been drowned out by something bigger. 60 years of shared sunrises, shared worries, shared joy. You couldn't undo a lifetime of love with one secret, no matter how deep it ran. That night, she slept more peacefully than she had in weeks. He stayed in the chair beside her bed, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to her soft breathing. The house was quiet except for the hum of the oxygen machine and the occasional creak of the old floorboard settling. He thought about their children, about how they'd react when she was gone, about whether he'd ever tell them the truth. He still didn't know. Maybe it wasn't his to tell. Maybe some secrets were meant to stay buried, not out of shame, but out of respect for the life that grew in spite of them. He dozed off for a little while, head resting against the back of the chair. When he woke, she was looking at him, her eyes wide open in the dim light. You should be in bed, she whispered. So should you, he teased gently. She smiled, then reached for his hand again. Stay. I'm here. She closed her eyes but kept hold of him. And in that quiet room, with the night stretching long and soft around them, something shifted. Not in the world, but in him. The last of the hardness melted away, not because he'd forgotten, but because he finally understood. Love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up again and again, even when you've been hurt, even when you're scared, even when the truth is messy. The next morning, she was weaker. She could barely lift her head, and her voice was so soft he had to lean close to hear her. But her mind was clear, and her eyes still held that familiar warmth. Their daughter came by midday, bringing soup and fresh flowers. She chatted softly, brushed her mother's hair, held her hand. He watched from the doorway, heart aching at the love between them, so pure, so simple. After she left, he sat beside the bed again. The sun streamed through the window, lighting up dust motes in the air like tiny stars. Thank you, she said suddenly. For what? For staying. For loving me. For being the man you are. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead. You're the one who made me that man. She smiled, then closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed, deepened, He stayed there, holding her hand, watching the sunlight move across the floor as the afternoon wore on. In the days that followed, she drifted in and out, sometimes awake and talking, sometimes lost in dreams. He read to her when she was alert, played her favorite hymns on the old record player when she slept. He told her stories about the grandkids, about the garden, about the neighbor's cat that had finally stopped stealing shoes, and every time she opened her eyes, she looked for him, and every time he was there. One evening, as twilight settled over the house, she whispered his name. He leaned close. "I'm ready," she said. He didn't argue, didn't beg her to stay. He just nodded, tears streaming down his face, and held her tighter. "I love you," he said. "I love you more," she whispered back. And then, slowly, peacefully, she let go. He sat with her for a long time after, not moving, not speaking. The house was quiet, too quiet. But he didn't feel alone. Because in that room, surrounded by 60 years of love, he could still feel her. In the worn armchair where she'd read, in the coffee mug with the chip on the rim, in the way the light hit the floor at this exact time of day. She was gone, but the love wasn't, and that, he realized, was what mattered most. The house felt too big after she was gone. Not empty, never empty, but too full of silence in all the wrong places. The coffee pot still sat on the counter, but no one reached for it in the morning. The crossword puzzle lay untouched on the table. The porch swing creaked in the wind, but no one sat there to watch the sunset. He moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching things she'd touched, sitting in chairs she'd warmed, trying to find her in the ordinary places where she used to be. The funeral was small, just like she'd wanted. Family, a few old neighbors, the pastor from the church they'd attended for 50 years. People brought casseroles and hugged him too long, their eyes wet with tears they didn't try to hide. He thanked them quietly, accepted their kindness, but didn't say much. Words felt too heavy, too small for what he was carrying. Their children stayed for a week after, cleaning, sorting, helping him figure out what came next. They didn't ask about the will or the house or the bank accounts. They just sat with him, made him eat, walked with him in the garden now blooming with tulips they'd planted together just weeks before she got sick. Every petal felt like a promise she'd kept, even from beyond. One evening, as they sat around, the kitchen table, the same one where they'd shared thousands of meals, he looked at them and knew it was time. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice steady but soft. They stopped talking, turned to him with gentle concern. He took a breath, then told them the truth, not with drama, not with blame, but with honesty. He explained what she'd told him in those final days. About the separation early in their marriage, about the moment of weakness, about how their oldest wasn't his by blood, but had always been his in every way that mattered. He watched their faces as he spoke, saw the shock, the confusion, the flicker of hurt. But then, slowly, understanding. Their oldest son, the one at the center of it all, was quiet for a long time. He stared into his coffee, fingers wrapped around the mug like it was the only thing holding him steady. Then he looked up, eyes glistening. "You raised me," he said simply. "You taught me how to be a man. You were there for every single thing that mattered. That doesn't change because of something that happened before I was born." His voice didn't waver. There was no anger, no bitterness, just quiet certainty. "You're my dad," he added. "Always have been." The others nodded. Their daughter reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Mom loved you more than anything," she said, "and she loved him too, just like you did. That's what matters." He felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was still knotted tight. He'd feared this moment for weeks, imagined their confusion, their pain, their questions. But instead, they gave him grace. Not because the truth was easy, but because love was stronger. After that night, things shifted. Not back to normal because normal was gone, but towards something new. Something honest. He started writing again. Not letters to anyone in particular, but to her. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a notebook and a cup of tea and write about the day, the birds at the feeder, the neighbor's new puppy, the way the lilacs were blooming early this year. He told her about the grandkids' school plays, about fixing the leaky faucet, about how much he missed her laugh. He never sent the letters. He just kept them in a box on the shelf beside her favorite teacup. It felt like talking to her, like keeping her close in the only way he could now. Spring turned to summer. The garden grew wild and bright, more than it had in years. He didn't plan it that way. He just watered it when he remembered, pulled a few weeds here and there, and let the rest grow as it pleased. Sunflowers towered near the fence. Zinnias spilled over the edges of the beds. Bees buzzed lazily in the heat. It felt alive, like she was still tending it somehow. Their oldest started visiting more often, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. They'd sit on the porch, in the evenings, just like they used to, and talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes they'd work on the old truck together, hands greasy, shirt stained with oil. Other times they'd just watch the fireflies blink on in the yard, comfortable in the silence. One night, as they sat side by side in the rocking chairs, his son said, "You know, I used to wonder why I didn't look like you." He turned, surprised. "You did?" "Yeah," his son said with a small smile. "But then I figured maybe I just got Mom's side. And honestly, I was glad. She was beautiful." He laughed softly. She was. They sat for a while longer, listening to the crickets. Then his son added, "I never doubted you were my dad. Not for a second." Those words settled deep in his heart like a stone finally finding the bottom of a quiet pond. The grandkids came often, too. They ran through the house like they owned. It left toys in the hallway, spilled juice on the rug, and he didn't mind. He made cookies just for them, saved the last piece of pie, read them stories in the same chair where she used to sit. They called him Grandpa, with the same trust and love they'd always had, and in their eyes, he saw her smile, her patience, her joy. He realized then that legacy wasn't about blood. It was about what you passed down, the kindness, the values, the quiet strength. And she'd passed it all on, through him, through their children, through the way they loved each other even when things got hard. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, he found a shoebox tucked behind a stack of blankets. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded ribbon. He recognized her handwriting immediately. They were the letters he'd written her during their early years when he was away at school. She'd saved everyone. He sat on the dusty floor and read them aloud, his voice cracking on the parts where he'd been nervous, hopeful, scared. He could almost hear her laughing at his awkward poetry, rolling her eyes at his over-the-top promises. But she'd kept them, all of them. Because even then she'd believed in them, in him. He cried that day, not from sadness but from gratitude, for the life they'd built, for the love that had lasted, even when it was imperfect, for the truth that had come too late to change the past but just in time to heal the future. As the months passed, he began to find rhythm again. Not the same rhythm as before. Nothing would ever be the same. But a new one, shaped by loss and love and memory. He joined the church choir again, something he hadn't done since she got sick. He started walking to the park every morning, feeding the ducks, nodding to the same faces he saw every day. He even agreed to help the neighbor fix her fence, something he would have put off forever when she was alive. People said time heals all wounds. He wasn't sure that was true. Some wounds don't heal. They just become part of you, like a scar that aches in the rain but reminds you you're still here. What healed him wasn't time. It was truth. It was forgiveness. Hers for herself. His for her. Theirs for each other. It was the choice every day to honor what they'd built instead of tearing it down over something that happened in a moment of weakness, 60 years ago. He never told anyone outside the family. Not because he was ashamed, but because it wasn't anyone else's story to carry. It belonged to them, to their love, their mistakes, their redemption, and in the end, that's what mattered. One evening in early fall, he sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the leaves turn gold and red. The air was crisp, the sky clear. He thought about her, about how she'd loved this time of year, how she'd always said fall was nature's way of showing us how beautiful letting go could be. He smiled, lifted his cup slightly as if toasting her. "You were right," he whispered. A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of wood smoke and apples. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. Inside the house, the old clock ticked steadily on. He wasn't alone. He never had been, because love like theirs didn't end with a last breath. It lived on, in the way their children cared for each other, in the stories they told their grandchildren, in the quiet strength they showed when life got hard. It lived in the garden, in the letters, in the coffee mugs left on the counter. It lived in him, and as long as he remembered, really remembered, not just the secret but the 6,